Thank you so much, Tom. Our monthly theme for November is living love through the practice of repair. And we're here today to talk about how to repair what is broken in the United States. In a time of war and violence across the globe, of bald-faced attacks on immigrants, trans beloveds, and anyone who can become pregnant right here at home. We're here today as climate crisis unfolds in the United States and around the world, and yet carbon emissions rise alongside corporate profits. So many of us can't afford a place to live or physical or mental health care, and we are in pain as we experience or watch our siblings experience the brokenness of systems that allow our kin to fall through the cracks. We pulled millions of kids out of poverty in 2021, only to let them fall back in when the expanded child tax credit expired. Our communities are plagued by gun violence. My kids do regular active shooter drills at school. There is so much to repair, and it is so reasonable to grieve for all that is broken. November of 1969 was also a time when brokenness of the United States was on full display. The year before, in 1968, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. The US was going to the moon, but even this miracle of science was an outgrowth of the Cold War capitalist US against communist Russia in the race to space. Even though Brown versus Board of Education had been decided 15 years before, the Supreme Court was still having to tell states that they must desegregate schools. In 1969, the Chicago police killed leaders of the Black Panther Party, and a riot against police violence at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, led by trans women and drag queens, launched the modern LGBTQ+ movement. The Vietnam War was raging, and students were protesting. I wasn't there, but many of you were, and I wonder how what you're feeling now compares with what you felt back then. Into this landscape came Sesame Street, which debuted 55 years ago today, November 10th, 1969, starring Jim Henson's Muppets and a racially integrated cast of humans helping kids get ready for school through television, because then, as now, school readiness is a problem for marginalized children, including poor kids and kids of color, kids who get the least investment from our society. For a moment, Sesame Street was actually banned in Mississippi for its portrayal of a truly integrated community. We heard earlier how Jim Henson, who created the Muppets of Sesame Street, felt like he couldn't change the big things in the world, so he needed to focus his energy where it can make an impact. Can you raise your hand if you watched Sesame Street as a kid? Can you raise your hand? Keep those up, keep those up. Raise your hand now if your kids watched Sesame Street. Some of us have 2 hands up. How about your grandkids? Have your grandkids watched Sesame Street? Look at all these hands. Thank you. You can put them down now. Please never doubt that focusing on the work that is yours to do makes an impact. Look at all the lives one puppeteer was able to touch. So today, on the 55th anniversary of a television show that initially received half its funding from US tax dollars, in this divided country, as we think about how to repair what is broken, let's look to the model of Sesame Street, to envision the kind of country that we'd like to live in, to remember that countries are made up of streets, of neighborhoods, of congregations, interdependent webs of small communities that have the opportunity to live our values regardless what the larger structures we're embedded in are doing. Some of you might think it's a little frivolous to be talking about Sesame Street when the times are so urgent, and yet one of the reasons we need to model ourselves on Sesame Street in these urgent times is because that joyful community of giant birds and fuzzy monsters doesn't shy away from having the tough conversations. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, Sesame Street held an online town hall to help children and families make sense of what was happening. Today, there are Sesame Street Muppets with autism, whose parents are incarcerated, who have been homeless, There are Black, Hispanic, and Asian American Muppets. Sesame Street offers a vision of an integrated, beloved community that faces what is hard to help us make sense of it together. Is that not who we want to be here at Saltwater Church? A place where even the grouchiest among us can find friendship and belonging, where we accept our friends, even the ones who are obsessed with pigeons, or who decide to play a little lullaby on the bugle before you go to sleep at night. The Muppets on Sesame Street make mistakes, and they certainly aren't perfect, but we love them anyway. Let's do the same for each other. While Sesame Street represents what our communities could look like at our best, Sesame Street has also seen us at our worst. Earlier this year, Elmo posted on Twitter, "Elmo's just checking in. How's everybody doing?" We flooded Elmo's comments with how not well we were all doing, inspiring Elmo and Louie, who we already saw this morning, to tour the TV morning talk shows, encouraging us to attend to our own and others' mental health. It was just about a year ago that Reverend James Kubal Komodo joined us to share a message about the loneliness epidemic that is sweeping our country and how congregations are uniquely poised to be part of meeting that need for connection. And today in this sanctuary, I see it happening. I see us making connections in the midst of those hard times that Elmo's innocent tweet uncovered. At its best, our congregation reminds me so much of Sesame Street, and our covenant of right relations is the teaching tool that helps us learn how to be together in community. Those commitments reflected in our covenant are visible on Sesame Street as well. Our covenant reminds us that we need to consider the potential impact of our words and actions, knowing that intent and impact are not always the same. We need to reflect on how our words and actions may affect marginalized people and listen to the ways we have impacted others when they are willing to share that impact with us. When fans asked, where were the Latine New Yorkers on Sesame Street? Maria and Luis moved in and started a family. Jim and the children's television workshop were willing to hear from marginalized people that they could do better and then make the changes to do better. When I was a girl, Prairie Dawn is the only Sesame Street regular I remember with she, her pronouns, and frankly, she was kind of boring. Now there's Zoe, Rosita, Abby Kadabi, Julia, and more. When Sesame Street learns better, it does better. We should be so wise, and in fact, our covenant offers us that wisdom. The tragedy of Jim Henson was that his work ethic was so deeply entrenched that he didn't know how to stop and care for himself when he was ill. He didn't listen when his body said, stop. When he died in 1990, doctors said if he had sought care just a day earlier, he might have lived. Jim Henson learned, like so many of us, to work not only as hard as he could, but harder. And it killed him. So please hear me when I say to you that we need to rest. We need to slow down, to pace ourselves for the work of building the beloved community, the work of being Sesame Street. And when our beloveds need a rest, it is incumbent upon those of us who are ready to go to take up the work for them. Especially to those of us who have been working so hard to see our value of democracy lifted up in this nation, please, now is the time. You've been working so hard. You need to rest. In this time of year, as the fields are fallow, as the nights are longer, look to the more than human world and heed its call to tend to yourself, to rest, because rest is your birthright. We don't just rest so we can get back into the fight, although I know you will when you are rested, but we rest because it is what we deserve. So it's been 55 years of Sesame Street, and we're still in the mess of division and broken systems that we find ourselves in today. Has Sesame Street really solved anything? I'd like us to consider that if it hasn't, maybe it's because we got too comfortable watching Sesame Street, and we didn't get to work on being Sesame Street. That's what I want to ask us to commit to today, beloveds. I want us to notice, feel, and do the things Elmo and Louie taught us to help us work through our feelings, and I want us to live the love that Jim Henson believed in. I want us to practice love, foster connection, act for justice, and be Sesame Street right here, right now, because what we are doing on our street, in our community, in our congregation matters, maybe now more than ever. If you want to build an alternative to a narrative that demonizes difference and values money over people, you've come to the right place, because here at Saltwater Church, we're trying to be Sesame Street instead. May it be so. May we be the ones who make it so. Amen.